Well, good afternoon, Bible school students.
Good afternoon.
It's good to be with you once again. For me, this is hump day. Get over this one, and then it's just two more after that, kind of downhill. Yesterday, we talked about the Battle of Thermopylae and Operation Market Garden. And the theme I was trying to bring out yesterday, or my objective, was greater love hath no man than this, that a man lay down his life for his friends. Now, Leonidas, who was the Spartan general, or actually he was the king of Sparta, who led his troops into battle and gave his life literally for others, did that in a physical sense. But this afternoon I'd like to take just a little time and get more practical and make a spiritual application of that. What does it mean for us to lay down our lives? Because most of us are not going to be called to actually physically give our lives. Now, that can happen. It did to the apostles. But most likely, we won't have to give our physical lives. Yet, there's a sense in which every day, I believe, we should be laying down our lives. Because greater love hath no man than this, that a man lay down his life for his friends. So I'd like to ask you, in a practical sense, what are some things we can do or should be doing to lay down our lives? Any thoughts? Not everybody speak at one time.
Giving up our own desires.
Giving up our own desires. Very good. Yes. I like that one.
Esteeming others.
Uh-huh. Bible commands us to do that, does it not? To esteem others better than yourself. Good.
Looking at the interests of others.
Good. Yes. Being able to empathize, if you will, being able to enter into someone else's experience and look after their interests rather than just looking out for number one. Good. Take time to listen. That's a good one. Take time to listen. Yes.
Taking the time to pray for people.
Pray for people. Good. Very good. That's a way of laying down our lives, all right, and putting others first. Any others? You're doing great.
We need to start by focusing on Jesus.
Yes. Very good. That is the place to start, all right, is by focusing on Jesus, because he's our perfect example in laying down his life for his friends. He did it literally as well as spiritually. Good. And remember, it's God's will that you be conformed more and more into his image. Any other thoughts? What does it mean to lay down our lives?
Loving your neighbor no matter how much it hurts.
Say that again.
Loving your neighbor no matter how much it hurts.
Loving your neighbor, no matter how much it hurts. That's an interesting thought. And we are commanded to love our neighbor. We're even commanded to love our enemies. Good. I put together just a little list here. Just helping someone in need. When we see somebody that has a need. This afternoon, one of my students dropped his 3-ring binder and he had a real mess all over the floor. He had a need, and others came to help him pick it up. Took him a long time to get everything back in order in his 3-ring binder, but just taking time to help someone when we see somebody in need is a way of laying down our lives for others. Putting others first on a daily basis. And I got some of these off of the internet. I kind of like the ones that you gave even better than these ones, to tell you the truth. But to think of others first, not just once in a while, but on a regular basis. And to give of our time and talents is a way of laying down our lives. To give of your expertise. Perhaps you have some area that you kind of shine in. Maybe it's technology, maybe it's woodworking, maybe it's mechanics, but giving of your expertise and not expecting anything in return is a way of giving up your life for others, laying down your life for others. Giving of your money, this one hurts me a bit because I don't have a lot, but giving of our money is a way, too, of laying down our lives. And then I have this one. And this one, I guess, is just for me. But Ephesians 5:25 tells us that you should love your wife as Christ loved the church and gave himself for her. Now, we actually are the bride of Christ. So I think this principle applies to the church as well. But certainly in marriage, I know my son claimed that he was going to take Jesus' example, and he was going to wait till he was 33 years old to lay down his life and get married. I think he made it to 21. But, you know, the man doesn't have power over his own body anymore, nor the woman over hers. I remember when I was getting ready to be married, I got a lot of advice. Some people told me that marriage is a 50-50 relationship. You give half, your wife gives half, and you'll be happy. But then there's that 50% that we hold back, and the other 50, which leads to 100% of unhappiness. I even had one person go so far as to say it's a 60-40. You should give 60 and hope for 40 back. But you know, it's actually 100 and 0. Just think, if you give everything and expect nothing in return, and your spouse gives everything and expects nothing in return, what a happy relationship you'll have. And you know, I think that applies to the church as well, that we should give expecting nothing really. I'd like to take time to turn back to the 15th chapter of John, if you would with me, please. John chapter 15 is where this verse comes from. Greater love has no man than this, that a man lay down his life for his friends. And I'd like to begin in verse 1, actually, of John chapter 15. And John chapter 15, I'm kind of jumping in the middle of the longest discourse that Jesus had with his disciples, at least that we have recorded. John chapter 14, 15, and 16 is one big discourse. It was the discourse at the Last Supper, the last time he was going to be with his disciples. And he had a lot to share with them. And here in John chapter 15, the first 3 verses, he tells his disciples how he is the true vine. He said, I am the true vine, and my Father is the husbandman. Every branch in me that beareth not fruit, he takes away. And every branch that beareth fruit, he purges it, that it can bring forth more fruit. Now you are clean through the word which I've spoken unto you. So I think it's the word that purifies us, that purges us, that prunes, that trims us. Stories told of a doctor who had some money to invest, and he purchased a vineyard. Knew nothing about a vineyard, but he purchased a vineyard, and he hired a man to go out and prune it for him. It was an older man who was experienced, and he went out and he trimmed the vines back, just the way they're supposed to be, but very dramatically. And when the doctor came to inspect his work, he was shocked by how much the man had cut off. And he was very angry. And he went up to the man and he took his pruning shears away from him and he threw them on the ground and broke them. And he told the man to get out and don't ever come back. You've ruined my vineyard. But the next spring, that vineyard blossomed out, and it bore a tremendous amount of fruit. And the doctor was shocked and surprised. And he called the same man up and asked him to come back. And the man was a little reluctant after his last experience that he had had with him. But when he got there, the doctor had a new pruning shears that he handed to him. And he apologized. And he said, I'm very sorry. You knew what you were doing. Would you please go and prune my vineyard again for me? So the man went out and pruned it, and when he was all finished, the doctor was there, and he was very pleased, and he said, it looks beautiful, but please, couldn't you take just a little bit more off? Wow, is that my attitude when I get pruned? Lord, couldn't you take just a little more off? You know, Jesus is the vine, we're the branches that bear fruit. and his Father is the husbandman that prunes us so that we can be more fruitful. Verses 4 and 5 tell us about that vital relationship between the branch and the vine, where Jesus said, "Abide in me, and I in you. As the branch cannot bear fruit of itself, except it abide in the vine, no more can you, except you abide in me. I am the vine, ye are the branches. He that abides in me, and I in him, the same will bring forth much fruit. For without me, you can do nothing." Isn't that quite a profound statement that Jesus is giving to his disciples? Without me, you can do nothing. I want to look at an example of a man who tried to do it without Jesus, and it didn't work. But let me go on, first of all, to verses 6 through 8, which tell us of the price of not abiding. Verse 6, "If a man abideth not in me, he is cast forth as a branch and is withered, and men gather them and cast them into the fire, and they're burned. If you abide in me, and my word abide in you," here's a great promise, "if ye abide in me, and my word abide in you, you shall ask what ye will, and it shall be done. Herein is my Father glorified, that you bear much fruit, so shall ye be my disciples." So the price of not abiding and the promise to those who do abide. Verses 9, 10, and 11 tell us about the link between love and obedience. Verse 9 says, "As the Father hath loved me, so have I loved you. Continue in my love. If you keep my commandments, ye shall abide in my love, even as I have kept my Father's commandments and abide in his love. These things have I spoken unto you, that my joy might remain in you, and that your joy might be full." There's no getting around it. If we love Jesus, we will keep his commandments. But you know, when you love somebody, it's not hard to do things for them. It's a joy. Daughters used to say, "Do I have to wash the dishes?" No, not if you want to. Then you get to. And you'll enjoy it when you're doing it because you want to. And when we think of all that Jesus has done for us, isn't it only our reasonable service that we do for him? And doesn't it bring joy when we do? "This is my commandment," verse 12, "that ye love one another as I have loved you." Love one another. Love as disciples. If we love as disciples, we will have unity instead of rivalry. We'll have trust instead of suspicion. We'll have obedience instead of self-assertion. Around the year 340, there was a man named Jerome who translated the Bible into Latin, and his translation was known as the Vulgate. When he got to be a very old man, probably about 63 years old, when he got to be a very old man, he couldn't walk to assemblies anymore, and they had to carry him in. But they always looked to him for some kind of word of encouragement, and he always gave them the same 5 words. And the 5 words that Jerome always said were, "Little children, love one another." That's all he would say. Little children, love one another. Finally, someone asked him, "Why do you always just keep saying that? Little children, love one another." And he said, "Because it's the command of the Lord. And the observation of it alone is sufficient." There was a lawyer one time that came to Jesus and asked him, "What's the greatest commandment?" And Jesus turned it around and said, "Well, what do you think it is?" And he said, "Love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, soul, mind, and strength," with our entire being. And Jesus said, "You just answered well." And the second commandment is just like unto it. Love your neighbor as yourself. On these 2 commandments hang all the law and the prophets. If we do those, we'll take care of all the 10 and all the other commandments and everything that Jesus would want us to do. It's all summed up in one word, love. And indeed, God is love. And then finally, verse 13, greater love hath no man than this, that a man lay down his life for his friends. And we looked at some ways, and you have some good ideas about, on a practical sense, on an everyday sense, how we can lay down our lives for others. Verse 14, ye are my friends if you do whatsoever I command you. Again, we can't get around it. Obedience is a sign of our love for our Lord. And Jesus says, henceforth I call you not servants, for the servant doesn't know what his Lord is doing, but I have called you friends. For all things I have heard of my Father, I've made known unto you. I've called you friends. Jesus treats us not as servants, but as friends. Charles Spurgeon said, abstinence from evil is a great part of righteousness, but it's not enough for friendship. Now, back in 1720, there was a man attending Oxford University, Christ's Church. His name was John Wesley. He was a very disciplined religious man, but he was trying to do it on his own. He even became ordained in the Anglican Church, the Church of England. And he became a missionary and came to the United States. He came to Georgia to try to convert the Indians. And he failed terribly because he was doing it himself. Even though he was a religious man, even though he had been ordained as a minister in the Church of England, he had not been converted. And he was trying to do everything on his own strength. He founded the Holy Club. He was a very disciplined, devout person, very religious, but not saved. On the trip to America, there were some German people on the same boat that he was on. And they were coming more or less for the same reason. They were coming to be missionaries. They were Moravians. And he had very good talks with them and saw that they too wanted to come to found a pure church and a simple church. And that's what he wanted to do. But while he was here in Georgia, he made a real mess out of things. And he went back to England, very unsuccessful. While they were coming over here, there was a terrible storm at sea. And the water was crashing over the ship and coming down through the floorboards. And the Moravians sat calmly and sang while everybody else, including John Wesley, panicked. And he saw that in them. And he realized that they seemed to have something that he didn't. Did you know there are Moravians here in Lancaster County? There's a Moravian church over in Lidditz. Used to be a time that you couldn't live in Lidditz unless you were a Moravian. It was an original Moravian settlement. John Wesley then, when he went back to England, sought out a Moravian church. It was on Aldersgate Street. And he went to a service there. His brother Charles, who wrote about 1,000 hymns, had already been converted. And he went to a service there, and he said that about 8:15, while the minister was reading from such and such passage, I felt my heart strangely warmed. And he had a conversion experience. He went on to say that he exchanged faith of a servant for the faith of a son. Before that, he had considered himself a servant. But Jesus doesn't consider us servants. He considers us friends. In fact, more than that, he considers us brothers with him. John Wesley then went on to preach 40,000 sermons. He converted many people in England. He traveled on horseback, often reading his Bible while he was going along, often getting knocked off his horse by tree branches because he wasn't paying attention. He was studying for his next sermon. Caught in the rain, but he traveled on horseback, it's estimated about 250,000 miles. 250,000 miles would take you around the earth at the equator. 10 times. That's how far he traveled in his lifetime, preaching over 40,000 sermons. He was no longer welcomed in the Church of England. When he started telling people that they were sinners, they said, "We're not sinners, we're part of the church. You get out of here." So he went to the common people. You see, to go to church in England at that time, you had to pay a rent for your pew. Hey, Tim, I got an idea here. Never mind. But you had to pay rent for your pew, so the poor people didn't go to church. It was only the wealthy people. And when he was telling the wealthy people that they were sinners, we don't want to hear that, man. So he went out and preached in the open air, and thousands of people gathered unto him. Why? Because he exchanged the faith of a servant for the faith of a son. And he did things now out of love. And he did things in the power of God's Holy Spirit. Well, I did promise you that we were going to talk about Gladys Aylward this evening. And Gladys Aylward is known as the Little Woman. Here we go. The small woman, actually. Gladys Aylward was born in 1902. And she died just a little bit before her 68th birthday in 1970. Now, in looking at the picture that I chose to put up there of her, that's a picture of her when she was an older woman. Did my microphone just go off? Sounds like it. No? When she was an older woman, she had returned to England. This picture of her would make you think that that she was Catholic. She was not. Those men that are standing with her there in this picture are actually Anglican or Church of England ministers. And they kind of retain the Catholic garb, if you will. But she was not Catholic. She was from the Church of England. And she was known as the small woman. And there's a book that was written by a man named Alan Burgess that tells of her life. Maybe some of you have read it. How many of you have read it? Okay, you've got an advantage over me. I have not. But they also made a movie which was called, I think, The Sixth. I'll get it together here. The Inn of the Sixth Happiness, I think was the title of the movie, which is kind of a misnomer because she ran an inn that was called the Inn of the Eighth Happiness. But they made a movie back in the 1950s about her life called the Inn of the Sixth Happiness. And I did watch that movie, so I have the Hollywood version. Those of you who have read the book have an advantage over me. But greater love hath no man than this, that a man lay down his life for his friends. And this is what Gladys Aylward very much did. She laid down her life for her friends, even for her enemies. Here she is in her youth. And in her youth, she wondered why she was so short, as you could see in that previous picture, the small woman. She also wondered why she had such dark hair when everybody around her was tall and blonde and had blue eyes, and she had dark eyes. And she prayed about this. And she came to the conclusion that she had been called to go to China because she was short and dark. And she even told God, "Here's my Bible, here's me, here's my life savings, take me to China." She started out as a housemaid in her teens. She got a job working as a maid, very humble job, there in England, but praying that God would use her and get her somehow to China. She had her opportunity thanks to the China Inland Missions. And the China Inland Mission was founded by J. Hudson Taylor in 1865. And J. Hudson Taylor was a very successful missionary in China. In 1900, though, missionaries pretty much got thrown out of China during the Boxer Rebellion. And the Chinese, very suspicious of foreign people. because they've been abused and used by them so much. And they tried to drive all foreigners out. And it was called the Boxer Rebellion because of the stance that the Chinese took when confronting foreigners, driving them out of their country. Well, she, through the China Inland Mission, went on a 3-month missionary course. Sound familiar? She got sent by the China Inland Missions for 3 months to China. When she returned, she had a real desire to go back. And she went to the head of the China Inland Mission, certain that she'd be able to go back, but they offer her no further training. And she met with the head of the China Inland Mission there in London. And he said, "We're very sorry, Gladys, Miss Aylward, but we're not offering you any further training or sending you to China. You were there for 3 months, and you really just did not learn much of the language at all. But I'm not sure how much Chinese a person can really learn in 3 months. It's not an Indo-European language. It bears no similarity whatsoever. It sort of sounds like an aluminum can bouncing off a tin roof." So she was very disappointed, and she didn't know what to do. And the head of the China Inland Mission, now this is the Hollywood version, offered her a job. He said, "We get a lot of people who call us here with positions for housekeepers. Do you have training in have you done any housekeeping?" And she said, "Well, yes, I have." So he gave her the name of a man there in London who was looking for another housekeeper. He already had several, but was looking for another housekeeper. So she went to work for him there in London. But her real desire was to return to China. One day she walked past a travel agency. And she went inside and she said, "I would like to purchase a ticket to China." And the travel agent said, "Well, the best way to get there is to get on a ship, sail down through the Suez Canal and on around. And how much does that cost?" "So many pounds." "Well, that's out." "Don't you have a cheaper way to get there?" "Well, there is a cheaper way, but you don't want to go that way." "Yes, I do." "What's the cheaper way to get there?" "Well, it's by rail across Europe and across Siberia." "That's what I want. I want to get there the cheapest way I can because I don't have the money." And when she was told how much it was, she realized it'd be a long time till she even had that amount. So she asked, this is the Hollywood version now, she asked the agent to set up an account, and she said, "I will come every payday, every time I get paid, every week, and I will put a little more towards this ticket until I finally get the thing paid for and can go." She spent her life savings on that train ticket to return to China all on her own. When the time came for her to go, which I guess was October 15 of 1930, the man that she had been working for gave her the name of a contact that he had in China, a lady who ran an inn by the name of Jeannie Lawson. The agent that she bought the ticket from gave her food. And someone else gave her a little cash gift or a coat or something, because traveling on the Trans-Siberian Railroad was going to be very cold. But I have a quote up here, which is actually from Gladys herself. "If God has called you to China or any other place, and you are sure in your own heart, let nothing deter you. Remember, it is God has called you, and it is the same as when he called Moses or Samuel." She was a very determined young lady. Struck out on her own across the Trans-Siberian Railroad. Now, the reason she was warned not to go on the Trans-Siberian Railroad is because there was an undeclared war between China and Russia at this time. And they told her this is very dangerous. And at several stops, people were pulled off the train and said, "Don't go any further." But she was determined, and she was captured by the Soviets. And thanks to some local people, she received help and was able to escape, and eventually got on a boat to Japan. And while she was in Japan, she went to the British consul, who helped her get to China. It was a miracle, really, that she ever got there. It's a miracle she wasn't killed. But she made it to China because she was sure that God had called her. I have found a map here that kind of shows the route that she took. She started in London, took a boat across to the Netherlands, then the train across Berlin and Poland and into Russia. Well, you know what? I think this map's actually a little better, which shows the route that she took, leaving London and going to the Netherlands, then by rail across Germany and across Poland. Here, I believe she is now crossing Belarus. Ukraine is down here. Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia. Remember I told you about Eugene, who was from Latvia, is up here somewhere. And she went across, this is Moscow, and a whole way across, somehow or another, finally got on a boat to Japan. Here they helped her at the British Council to get over, and she had to walk the rest of the way, but she made it to the Inn of the Eight Happinesses. And she met an older lady by the name of Jeannie Lawson. The Eight Happinesses probably has something to do with Confucianism or something, but the eight happinesses are love, truth, beauty. Sorry, I can't read my own writing. Looks like gentleness, that's what it is, tolerance, loyalty, devotion, and virtue. The Inn of the Eight Happinesses was owned by Jeannie Lawson. It was very run down. They had to clean it up and do a lot of repairs to it. And in those days, there were no lorries, trucks, that took goods across the mountainous region of China. Instead, it was taken on donkeys with donkey drivers, these mule drivers. And they needed a place to stay each night and food. And that's who they were appealing to. But they were foreigners, and the Chinese people wanted nothing to do with them. They had to go out and plead with them to come into their inn and stay with them tonight. And they offered them hospitality, a place to sleep and a meal. They also offered them Jesus. And while they were eating, Jeannie Lawson, who spoke good Chinese, would go out and tell them stories to entertain them. Stories about Jesus. Unfortunately, it wasn't too long till Jeannie died. And now the inn passed to Gladys. Fortunately, there were some employees there, and one of the employees took over telling the stories. Well, she worked very hard to master Chinese language. But it was very difficult times. She didn't have enough money to keep the inn going. She had to develop a new source of income. So she became an assistant to the government of the Republic of China. You see, she was very well appreciated and respected in the little community. It was actually a little walled city that she was living in there in China. And the leader of that city appreciated her, and the government employee, or head of the government that came around, liked her, and they offered her a very important, glamorous job where she could make money and keep the inn going. That very important, glamorous job was foot inspector. You might think I'm joking, but no, it was foot inspector. You see, since about the 10th century AD, there was a custom, especially in rural China, of taking women's feet and wrapping them very tightly to keep them from growing. And it was considered a sign of beauty to have your feet wrapped and crippled. By the time Jeannie got there in the 1930s, it was still being practiced, but the government was passing laws against it. Yet there was great resistance. And the local people, especially the men, were fighting against it because it was a way of controlling the women and keeping them under control because they couldn't move around very well. And she went out and convinced people that this practice of crippling people has got to stop. And she was rather successful, this little woman. She also then actually became a Chinese national in 1936 because she was highly respected. And she started, and that's what this picture is supposed to be showing, she started an orphanage with just a couple of children, a handful at first. And she even got involved in prison reform. There was a riot at the prison in the little town where she was because the warden was holding back the food from the prisoners and using it for himself or selling it. And a riot broke out. Now, this is the Hollywood version. But a riot broke out, and everybody backed off from the prison, and she went, little woman that she was, walked right into the prison. Big Chinese man with an axe. She walked up to him and took the axe away and asked why they're doing this. And they told her. They elected a spokesman. And she said, "This will change." And she went to the head of the town and told him what was, and the warden was replaced. She worked very hard for prison reform, besides being a foot inspector and running an orphanage. In 1938, the Japanese invaded China. It was actually the beginning of World War II in that part of the world. And at that time, her orphanage grew because the Japanese planes came in, dropped bombs on their little town, and strafed them with machine gun fire. And a lot of people were killed, and there was a number of new orphans. So her little handful of orphans became a large group of orphans, numbering almost 50. More orphans were brought from another town and were abandoned on her doorstep, so she had about 100 of them. The leaders of the town called for an assembly and said, "The Japanese soldiers now are headed this way. We have to abandon this town and move into the mountains." Here she was with about 100 children, and she had to flee in 1938 to the mountains. Fortunately, the children that were dropped on her doorstep had a letter saying that if she could get them to Sian, which was a city in another province about 240 miles away, that they would take them there. So she led 100 orphans over the mountains to Sian in a neighboring province, about 240 miles. She figured that it would take her about a week. Problem is, she ran into Japanese soldiers along the way, and she had to abandon the road and go through unmarked territory, and it took her more like 2 or 3 weeks. And she did get some help from some of the cities along the way, but she had to try to feed 100 orphans every day and keep them walking and moving forward. She converted many of them to Christianity as they saw her faith and heard her talk about Jesus, and she herself was actually wounded. But she, despite her wounds, went on to lead these 100 orphans over the mountains. When she got, now this is the Hollywood version, but when she got to that orphanage in Sian, who did she meet there? The very doctor from London who told her that they weren't going to offer her any more training because she wasn't able. She was the little woman who won China. In 1949, though, the communist takeover of China occurred. Mao Zedong led the communist invasion or revolt, and communism took over the country. And communists, one thing they hate is Christianity. They're very much antichrist. And they actively sought out missionaries and killed them and drove them out of the country. So she had to return to England in 1949. And she went on to lecture and travel around and tell people about what was happening in China. She wasn't there, but her heart still was. In 1958, she attempted to return once again to China. And she went to Hong Kong, which at that time was a English colony, and tried to get into communist China. But they wouldn't let her in, and she settled in Taiwan instead, which is an island off the coast of China where Chiang Kai-shek and his Democratic Republic fled to. And there in Taiwan, she founded the Gladys Aylward Orphanage until her death in 1970. I have a quote that I'd like to close with. I found this online. Later in her life, Gladys Aylward said, "I wasn't God's first choice for what I've done in China. I don't know who it was. It must have been a man, a well-educated man. I don't know what happened to him. Perhaps he died. Perhaps he wasn't willing. But God looked down and saw Gladys Aylward, and God said, well, she's willing." And I think that's a real challenge. We need to be willing to lay down our lives for others. Let's bow our heads for prayer. Our Father, we thank you for your goodness to us and your mercy, and we thank you for the example of this little woman, Gladys Aylward, who was willing to lay down her life for others. And we thank you that you were willing to lay down your life for us and take it up again. And help us, Father, to find ways each day to spiritually lay down our lives as well. So we thank you for Bible school and for the opportunity to learn and to grow together. And help us, Father, to further your kingdom and walk in your will and be filled with your Spirit each day. We thank you now for this time together in your goodness. In Jesus' name, amen. Thank you. God bless you.